We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website is bookedonrock.com. Jen B Larson is our guest. She's here to talk about her new book called Hit Girls, Women of Punk in the USA, 1975 to 1983. Hit Girls is the story of local and regional U.S. bands whose legacy would be otherwise lost. Larson dispels the narrative that women are anomalies in rock music. In fact, as you'll read in the book, women have played important roles in every city and every scene all over the country, but few, if any, know about most of them. The women in this book are now rightfully exalted to cult status. Their achievements are inspiring new generations of women rockers, and you'll hear from them in this book, which also features over 100 rare and never-before-seen images. So let's talk about the women of punk in the USA from 1975 to 1983 right now with author Jen B. Larson. And make sure you head over to the show notes page for a playlist of some of the artists we talk about in this episode. Jen, welcome to the podcast. Great to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you too.
You note at the start of this book, stories of women in early punk have been getting more attention in rock media lately. Susie Quatro, the Runaways, the Go-Go's, Patti Smith, Debbie Harry. Those are some of the most visible and known punk rock artists, but there are many who deserve some recognition, and those are the women you focus in this book. When did you decide you wanted to write this book, and what inspired you?
I guess it was around 2017. My band had broken up. I was really bored. And something I found myself doing was going on YouTube and just kind of like channel surfing and finding a lot of different music I liked. And there was a point when I started realizing there were so many bands of women in like punk and new wave and this, this early era that I wrote about that existed that I just never heard of before. So I just started kind of obsessively keeping lists of them. And I was like, wait a second, I thought women were anomalies during this period. And that the Riot Girls were like the first women of punk music, and, the Patti Smiths and the Go-Go's and Debbie Harry were just kind of like these standouts. And once I realized that there were just so many women doing this work, and I started thinking about the X-Ray Specs and like bands that I did know about, the Raincoats and the Slits, I was like piecing this together. I realized that this was like really important. And so I just started becoming really obsessed with it. And I started a blog, and I found friends of mine who are like obsessive record collectors who were really interested in the topic and really interested in a lot of these bands. And they started turning me on to, I got a reference of female fronted punk rock compilation that has hundreds of songs with female fronted bands from like the late 70s to like the late 80s. I got the Subnormal Girls comps, and yeah, I realized this was just a huge topic, and it really deserved to be archived.
And you realize you had actually the problem of trying to fit all these bands into the book, right? The list gets longer and longer
every day. I mean, it's wild. I mean, I will run across a new band like every single day. And, one of my friends is a really obsessive record collector named Jen LeMasters. She owns a record store in Chicago, and she has an Instagram account where she posts her collection. And at least once or twice a week, she'll post a band that I've like never heard of before from around the world. Even these reference of female fronted punk bands, there's bands in there that I haven't done any research on. I have huge spreadsheet of bands just in this time frame in the USA that didn't even fit in the book. So it's exponential. It's amazing. And then I think about, these were just bands that like had access to recording. They had access to like stages where they could play. And there's probably all these other bands that just didn't even have that. Like they maybe weren't able to be recorded, or maybe they didn't really play many shows. And so they're just not documented.
Well, that's indicative of the problem. That's what this book addresses, is that a lot of these bands and these artists more than worthy of going on to becoming as known as a Debbie Harry, but kept down by the industry. And that's what we'll get to in a little bit. But first, let's get to your story. You have an interesting backstory. You got into a little trouble as a youth. As you write, you were grounded for half of high school, child of divorced parents. Didn't like to follow rules, and then you take up poetry and creative writing, and you discover a passion for writing, the angst of youth colliding beautifully with the pen. Then you are given a book by Annie Dillard and a mixed CD that lights a flame in terms of rock music. Can you tell this story and your introduction to punk rock?
I grew up in a divorced household. My family was dysfunctional in a number of ways. My older sister died when I was 9. So, I was angsty. My mom remarried when I was like 12, and I had to move to like a really boring suburb when I had grown up in the city. Yeah, I was just frustrated. I was just like an angsty teenager, and I didn't really feel like I fit into the suburbs at all. I could get along with people. Like I could get along with almost everybody that I went to high school with, but I knew that I didn't fit in. Like I just didn't really feel comfortable in my own skin. So I think that playing music and like writing were things that like helped me to connect with myself and to just like connect with things outside myself. If I was listening to music or reading, reading other authors. So yeah, I had a teacher that gave me it's funny that it's a teacher because it seems so dorky, but like I had a teacher who I'm friends with to this day who gave me a mixtape, and there was like a Liz Phair song on there. And
That's a cool
I, like,
teacher. That's
yeah,
cool
really
teacher.
it's super awesome. I mean, that's why we're still friends. But
You went on to
like,
become a teacher yourself too.
yeah,
Yeah.
I am. And, I have a punk club at school too.
Cool.
So my students are like way cooler than I was when I was their age. But so I had 2 teachers that were like really cool, and I'm actually still friends with both of them. But the dude, Joe, Mr. Sislo, gave me one of the mix CDs he gave me had a Liz Phair song on it, and I was like, who the fuck is this? This is amazing. I'd listened to Hole, I'd listened to Garbage, and like I still love, like to this day, like I was in a Hole cover band a few years ago, and I love Garbage. But like Liz Phair, there was something about Liz Phair that was just so raw that I hadn't ever experienced, just singing out of key, and just like the guitar was so imperfect, and I loved it, and I really connected with that kind of just like indie sound. And I hadn't really heard it before. Like I hadn't really heard anything that was like indie rock. Everything I had heard was like really overproduced stuff that was on MTV or like on the radio. Even the stuff I had found in chat rooms or whatever on AOL was still like I thought it was like maybe independent, but I didn't know what that meant.
You did a lot of digging for this book, took a lot of notes, and as you write, came up with enough material to fill an entire wing of an art museum.
Seriously.
What's the biggest thing you learned or took with you after completing this book? Like something that maybe you hadn't even expected going in, aside from the large number of bands and artists that you discovered?
Yeah, I think that was the big thing, was like there were just so many. I mean, to this day, it's just there's so many bands that like I just had, I had no idea about, and I'm just always blown away. But that's what's really cool about it. I think one of the things I didn't expect was that this time period was like between second wave and third wave feminism. So it was kind of in this like no man's land when women were feeling more empowered, and like women were like able to be creative with the boys, and they lived in sort of this non-gendered like creative place with the guys that were playing music and things like that. But like not all of them were explicitly feminist. Like there were some that identified as feminist, but a lot of them, like that word feminism was kind of this scary word to use, and it made people think that like you were a man hater, or you were like a lesbian or something. And that word wasn't necessarily something that all of the artists identified with, and not all of the artists wanted to identify themselves like as women playing music. They were like, I'm a person, I'm an artist, I'm making music, I'm doing something, and I don't want to be boxed into being a woman. So there was this sort of like non-gendered thing that a lot of women were feeling, that I didn't really expect that. And I think part of that is because in Riot Girl, it was explicitly feminist. It was explicitly like, we're women playing music, and we're women playing music. So, like you need to listen to us. Whereas, yeah, this early scene, it was kind of just like Patti Smith was very much like, just like, I don't want you to label me as a woman. And a lot of the artists at this time followed that pattern, and I think it makes a lot of sense, but I didn't necessarily expect it.
One thing I wondered as I'm reading the book, was there a better chance if it was a band that was maybe led by a female with male band members? Was there a better chance of them getting a record label deal as opposed to an all-female band?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's I mean, I don't know, I don't have the data in front of me or anything, but I think that it's fair to say that like the Go-Go's were like, I think,
just about to ask. Yeah, you got the
Yeah.
picture of them right behind you. So
Yeah.
what is it that they did, if anything, differently, or was it just right place, right time? Or
I mean, I think that they were right place, right time. I think they were making good songs. I think, there's a lot of things that, go into also being at the right place, the right time. But I think they were also willing to work within the industry. And I think that there were a lot of all female bands that like would never have worked within the industry in that way. They were playing, I guess there was a show like in New York where they played with the Contractions, who were a all female band. They were a 3-piece, they were a 4-piece for like a year or something like that. They were from San Francisco. And two of the band members in the Contractions were lesbians. So there was also just sort of like that discord there, like of, just not necessarily, not that no lesbians want to conform to like, just like the industry, but these particular artists were less willing to do that, and they were less willing to write pop songs and less willing to do the kind of just kind of girly thing that the Go-Go's did very well. So I think that there's just like with the Go-Go's, they had this willingness to kind of participate and to play along with the mainstream idea of femininity in a way that some other bands weren't willing to do, or just like didn't do, so they just didn't get a second look.
that plays a part, and you respect them for that, whatever their choice is, whether they want to go along with that or not. But I think about the story with the Ann and Nancy Wilson of Heart, the song Barracuda. This story about this rumor that two sisters are involved romantically, and some guy starts that rumor. It was in some article, and somebody comes up to Ann after one of the shows and says, "Hey, I heard you and your sister, you guys are an item," and she was pissed off, But that's the business that they were in, and you got to be. I would think the women in rock, you had to be tough, you had to stand your ground, and you had to put up with a lot of BS.
Yeah, I feel like there's always like this like sexualizing of women, whichever way they people want to go with it, but there always has to be like this sexual element to it, and I think that definitely creates obstacles, and it makes it frustrating.
You cover the artists from around the U.S., and the chapters get into the Midwest, the South, the Northwest, the West Coast, South, West Coast, North, and the East Coast. I want to get to some of the artists throughout, starting with the Midwest. Destroy All Monsters, who formed in 1974 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. A bizarre sense of humor which didn't go over well with the audience at their first public appearance. Can you tell this story?
Yeah, Destroy All Monsters, when they started, they had this idea that they were just like anti-music. They were like weirdo visual artists from Ann Arbor. They were really into like weird sci-fi movies, and just kind of like we're trying to make this philosophical point that they were kind of this like psychedelic anarchy. They had a zine that they were making, and I think initially really they were really involved in like that visual aspect, and like when they made music they wanted to sound like off-putting, so they were just using all sorts of like weird instruments like blenders and like broken keyboards and stuff. And so yeah, they played a show and they got booed off the stage, and I think this is like a really common thing for them. Like they would just play a show where people thought that they were like they hiring musicians, and they would just like make all this like chaotic noise, and everyone would just be like, oh my god, stop. Eventually they became more of a rock band. So
Oh, the singer's an amazing artist. Niagara, that's the singer's name, right? She painted the single covers and the album covers, and you do include her oil paintings in the book. Her art in multiple forms, you say, makes her that much more influential.
Yeah, I mean, she is like she has a serious, extensive painting career. Her paintings are really cool. And yeah, she did the single artwork. I love the oil paintings that are in the book. Like I'm actually really happy. I was talking to her and her husband, who goes by the Colonel, for a few years of trying to get pictures, and he would send me pictures, and we couldn't quite figure out who had taken them or like where the credits belonged. And eventually we just decided on, what if we put paintings in the book? And I'm really happy about it, because her paintings are so realistic looking. They're so cool. And it's really different. And I mean, they're the first band in the book, and I'm really happy about them being like the first band in the book, because they're one of the first bands I wrote about too. So
some interesting band names. Is it Chai Pig or Chi Pig or Chip Pig? From Akron, Ohio, named after a local chicken rib barbecue restaurant. And there's some from 1978, Ring Around the Collar, features lyrics by Devo's Mark Mothersbaugh, which is really cool. And this is a band who, as you're right, significantly impacted the Akron sound, along with Devo, the Pretenders, and the Waitresses, yet not talked about like the other bands. The songs are great, yet they couldn't land a record deal. They're a victim of sexism, you would say?
It's always speculation to conclude, why a band or like an artist in a scene is looked over. I mean, you think about it to this day, for every 100, 200 bands, there's always like 2 bands that get recognized. So that goes without saying, any gender, any, sex of the band members, that, it's going to happen that really good bands get looked over. I think it's important to note that, it's not just like, just me harping on the fact that like there's, these amazing bands with the women that, oh my God, it must be sexism because, they were ignored. There's a lot of great bands that get ignored in general, but, I do think it's really interesting that 2/3 of the members of Shy Pig were women, whereas like the other bands, Devo, all guys, Pretenders, just one woman, Waitresses, there were 2 women in the Waitresses, but only one up front because Tracy Wormwood played bass. And so I do think it's interesting that there were like 2 women up front. They were like really interesting. They were like really, they would get like big crowds, but they like couldn't get a record deal. And I just, I can't help but wonder if sexism had a role in that. I think that like the girls in the band had been playing in bands since high school, and they had kind of experienced the way that like male audiences treated them differently, just from a young age. And so like, I don't know, it seems to make sense.
Stoney Rivera, the singer of the band Dummy Club, who formed in Milwaukee in 1982. Stoney had to deal with sexism and racism. And sadly, she says sexism and racism in the music business hasn't changed all that much. There was a moment that she says radicalized her as a feminist, something that happened in her neighborhood.
So Stoney said, "What radicalized me as a feminist was seeing a woman in my neighborhood whose abusive husband had seriously injured her. And I remember cops saying, 'Does he pay the bills?' And she says, 'Yes.' And they were like, 'Well, there's nothing we can do about it.' And I knew it was wrong. And my mother sat me down and told me why that was wrong. And that just freaked me out. It was the 60s. There were no women's shelters."
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and she saw that as a little kid.
Yeah. And just knowing like, that's not right. That's not fair. This woman has nowhere to go. And she's like under her husband's thumb because he pays the bills. And the cops are like, what are we going to do? Because it's heartbreaking.
Jen B Larson is here to talk about her brand new book, Hit Girls, Women of Punk in the USA, 1975 to 1983. And I'm trying to recall, is it out yet? It's out now? Yes. The first band featured in the chapter on bands from the South is Pylon from Athens, Georgia, formed in 1978. What a great sound. This is before we started recording. I was talking about some of these bands I discovered through this book, and they have a great sound. The B-52s, also from Athens, huge fans. Not surprising. It's possible they could be as recognized as the B-52s. They had an offer to tour with a very famous band, but they turned it down. What happened? Who is that band and why?
They turned down a tour with U2, and then they called it quits.
Yeah. Not just any, not like U2 when they were just starting out, the right. Joshua Tree tour.
Yeah. But like,
why did they turn that down?
Well, I actually really admire their decision because, they were also a band of visual artists. So they were using their instruments to create an atmosphere, and Vanessa was using her words to create like imagery and things like that. And they didn't really intend to be a serious band. They didn't intend to be a band for as long as they did. Like they just wanted to make a couple cool songs, like get written about, and then just like be done with it. And so I think when the band started, things started getting intense and like serious, and there were maybe even like tensions in their relationships, they decided to call it quits, which I don't know. I mean, I respect
admirable.
That. A lot of bands don't know how to do that.
Sure. They knew the path that they wanted to go down, and that wasn't it. I believe that's one of the bands that you can hear on Spotify, I believe, because I was putting together the list, a Spotify list. So urge people to go over and check it out.
They just put out a box set of all their material too within the last few years, a year or two. I don't know. They're all running together now since the pandemic, or I don't know.
Any musicians that just would rather not talk, because you interviewed quite a few for the book. Anybody that just said, yeah, I'd rather not, it's in the past, and anything like that?
There were two people who turned down interviews. One of them was ESG. The reason behind that is they've always really wanted to have control over their narrative, which makes a lot of sense. It's something that, has been ongoing in their career. They got screwed over a lot in like the 80s and early 90s when people were sampling them without, giving them credit for the work and stuff like that. And I think they're really protective of their work. So yeah, they were one of the bands who were just like, good luck, we're writing our own biography. So
yeah,
it was a bummer because I would love to talk to them, but at the same time, I totally respect their decision to control their own story.
The current state of technology makes it a lot easier too. So you did email exchanges. Did you do Zoom interviews?
Yeah, I did. I did Zoom, email, phone calls. And the thing is because this is during the pandemic, I wasn't able to talk to a lot of people in person, but I did get to sit down with a few.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Screaming Sneakers, that's a great name, from Miami, Florida. And your lead for this chapter, it reads, they had the tunes, they had the look, and they had the audience. So why did the Screaming Sneakers not make it big when they relocated to New York City? What did you find out?
I think about the New York City relocation, it was just kind of one of those like small fish in a big pond type deals where people were just ignoring them because there's so much stuff going on at like CBGB's and Max's Kansas City. I think they played at CBGB's. I want to say, I don't want to say for sure, but I'm pretty sure that that's where they played, and they realized like everyone was ignoring them. Like, who are those people? Because they were new to town. So I think that that's kind of what happened in New York City, and they kind of realized like, actually, we like being adored in our own city in Miami, and even though that's not necessarily going to lead us to a huge record deal, they, it's like they preferred that. One of the things that happened to them was that Polydor Records brought them to England and, were trying to record with them, and they wanted to like change the sound. They wanted to like kick the band members, like the backing band out and turn Lisa into just like a lead singer type.
Heard that story so many times, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And like, they were like, no. And Lisa was like, this is not what I want. I mean, I think they kind of, trying to make that deal with her, like, you don't need your band because, you're the star. And she was just like, nope. And they kind of just put their foot down.
Yeah, stood her ground. The all-girl four-piece from Austin, Texas, The Foams, once named to a top 10 list of Texas bands in the Austin Chronicle, described as charmingly incompetent. That's a great description. They just disappeared into the night, as you say. A band like this who isn't around a while, but clearly made an impact. I would imagine researching this band isn't easy. Can you talk about the process and finding out about all of these bands? And a band like this, how difficult it is. You got to do some digging and you kind of reach a dead end, don't you, on some of these?
Yeah. I think I found the Foams like just doing like weird, little digs on Discogs. And I think I just like, I found them through Discogs. There are a lot of people that I located on Facebook when I, was able to talk to them so I could get information that was not, anywhere else. Irene, who is the singer, and she did the artwork. I think I saw, that I was on Discogs. I saw that she had done the artwork. I looked her up. I looked up her website, and I like put something into her contact form, like on her website, like, hi, I would really like to know more about, your band, The Foams. And she responded. And so we were able to talk. There were a few of these bands who like, there was no information anywhere about them, but because I was able to get in contact with somebody, thanks to, the gods of, social media or whatever, I was able to like talk to somebody in the band and just get their story and just be kind of one of the first people to document it.
Wow. And then you must have gotten the, somebody who knows the member in the band kind of thing, right? That starts to happen. And that's interesting because some of those bands, it just, even with the internet, they were out at a time when there really wasn't much, maybe a newspaper clipping here or there. And how about the appreciation? I'm sure these artists love the fact that you're giving them the attention that they deserved.
Yeah, I think especially some of the lesser known ones in the band are really, really appreciative. I've gotten a lot of really sweet notes. So I've gotten a lot of appreciation from those bands. I think some of the more well-known bands, artists in the book, I think they, they appreciate it, but they're maybe not as excited because, they have gotten, some more nods. But like, yeah, a band like the Foams or like the Brass Smears, the Clits, some of the bands that haven't had a lot of stuff written about them have just been so appreciative. It's felt really good to like, be able to give them the respect and dignity that they deserve as artists.
Yeah, the first band featured in the chapter on Northwest bands is the Dish Rags, a 3-girl band formed in Vancouver, Canada in 1976. Punk audiences liked them, but mainstream audiences not so much. Even the punk bands who liked them kept them down. And here's another band who couldn't get out from under that misogyny of the music business, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Dish Rag story, I feel like really, emphasizes the misogyny. They were teenagers. They were super young when they formed. It was like 1976. So it was pretty early in punk, especially for a place like Vancouver. There's a story about them playing a battle of the bands in Vancouver, and they weren't even allowed to play in the battle. Like they had to open up for the battle.
Oh my God.
Like and it was just because they were girls, I mean, there's no really other reason for it. And they just like weren't being given the openings, like they weren't being given the opening slots they deserved. Like all the bands with guys in them were like getting these great spots. And, I think there were a lot of people pressing them to dress sexier too. Like they kind of just wore like disheveled t-shirts and, baggy pants and stuff like that. And yeah, I think there were people who were just like, all right, well, if we make you guys, like sexier, maybe this will work better, that kind of thing. Yep. So I think there was this really, really direct, messed up misogyny and just really gross too, because they were teenagers.
Yeah, I know. From Bellingham, Olympia, Washington is The Accident, formed in 1977. Here's a band who had 3 different front women over a 4-year span, and you interviewed one of them, Lisa Nansen Cram, and you brought up her vocal style and how it was described as sounding like a cheerleader from hell. And you mentioned that to her. What did she have to say about her vocal style?
I did get to interview Megan too. She was like, she'd only played with them for a weekend.
Yeah, that's the one played with. Yes, for one weekend. That is a story too.
Yeah. So she had a really interesting experience. I think she got super sick on this like road trip and stuff. But Lisa was great to talk to. I talked to her on the phone, I think at least a couple of times, or we emailed a lot anyway too. We stayed in contact. When I asked her about that, I think she really thought that description was funny. I think, Lisa was really just trying to have a good time. And you can really tell with The Accident's music that, they had this really tongue-in-cheek humor. They were really into kind of like the Monkees and just kind of like goofy stuff too. So I think she really liked that description. She played it up, and she just liked to have a lot of fun with, what she was doing vocally with the band.
You were able to get some great comments from the members of the Brass Smears. I think I got that pronounced right. The Brass Smears, who are from Portland, Oregon, formed in 1980. Sadly, one of the members since passed. That's the thing. I think a few of the musicians you spoke with passed since you had written the book, right? Yeah. Angie Mima is her name. She was the band's vocalist. You asked the band, how did being women impact their experiences in Portland music at that time? And Angie had a great response. Can you talk about that and how another member talked about how the women stuck together, which I think is a common theme throughout this book too. Women, they get together much better, I think, than the guys. A lot of, fist fights breaking out, the Motley Crue stories, right? But yeah, she said it wasn't a competition.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that it's interesting too that they were in Portland, because I don't know, this scene specifically, I feel like the women were like really supportive of one another. I included one of the Brass Smears, like the liner notes. Susie Cream Cheese wrote liner notes for like a Neo Boys EP or LP, sorry, that came out. And she wrote about like seeing the Neo Boys and just like being like mesmerized by them. Like, who are these women? I want to be like them. I want to be their friend. And I feel like there was like a lot of that camaraderie in Portland in general. But yeah, what Angie said when I asked her about I said, how did being a woman impact your experiences in Portland music at the time? And Angie said, I think it made us more obnoxious, if anything. We were quite disdainful of being lumped into anything, but it was still somehow easier at that age, in that time, to work with other girls. Portland scene was really diverse though, and we didn't really get shut out of it. Yeah. So I love the like it made us more obnoxious. Like they were like it was like empowering or something, just being
Yeah.
like, okay, well you know, if you thought we couldn't do it and because we're girls, we're just gonna be louder and ruder and cruder than like, you know, we would have
Yeah.
been.
The Defiance. Yeah, that's great. That's great. One of the West Coast bands spotlighted in the book, The Bags, who formed in 1977 in Los Angeles. The idea starts with a three-way phone call between a group of girlfriends, including Alice Bagg, who you spoke with, and you asked her an interesting question having to do with men dressing and behaving more effeminately in music in the late 60s and early 70s, and how that opened the doors for more women in rock to be taken seriously. And what was her response to that?
This one, I'm not sure if I asked the question in the right way, but I did really like her response. I had noticed, you know, someone had said that to me recently that, you know, men dressing in like women's clothing had like made I had like opened doors for women to like be taken more seriously. And I was wondering how Alice felt about that because I specifically asked her because she was really into glam rock when she was a teenager. And so what she said was when guys in glam bands started wearing dresses and makeup, it wasn't always consciously done as an assertion of gender fluidity, though it definitely had that effect. Some of those early rock musicians were just dressing the part while others were expressing who they genuinely were. And so, you know, she mentioned some different trans musicians. And she says other rock dudes might have just enjoyed experimenting with their appearance and presentation without being fully aware of what their actions meant to others. I think that exposure to androgyny was helpful in opening up new possibilities of gender expression, but I'm not sure that it opened doors for female musicians. Perhaps it just left the door unlocked for women who wanted to push it open. So I thought that was cool. Because she did say like, yeah, it wasn't like an invitation for women to play. It just like maybe more women like I don't know, like maybe more women saw that opportunity and were like, all right, we're you know, here we are. We're gonna start making music. Because I think that was her experience.
Castration Squad, there's a name, from LA, formed in 1980. Before the advent of death rock, there was Castration Squad. What was this band all about? The look and sound, very goth. I gotta say, these, yeah, they look serious.
They were bizarre, and weird, and you know, they weren't, you know, they weren't serious at all. They were just they I think that's the funny thing about it is that they like look really serious and they look really scary. They're called Castration Squad, but like they were just messing around. You know, I think Alice had been asked to play bass a number of times in the band, and she was kind of just like, is this real? And she just kept getting asked to like play another show, and she'd be like, okay, I guess I'm playing another show. And you know, I think that yeah, the band was just really bizarre. There's some YouTube clips of them and they're really weird. I don't know, people should check them out if they
I can't remember if it's in the book or not, but like, are they all now like moms and taking kids to
yeah, some of them.
school, you know, to say,
Yeah.
this is what I did when I was your age. Yeah, check it out on YouTube. There's a band in this book that stands out to me, and it's because of their guitarist, the Avengers. And this is a band who formed out of San Francisco in 1977. Now, they had a following in that area. They were big. And their lead singer, Penelope Houston, the band's guitarist was a guy by the name of Jimmy Wilsey, who would later go on to join Chris Isaak's band. That's him on Isaac's hit, Wicked Game. But getting back to the lead singer, Penelope Houston, and you say her look changed and challenged the parameters of normalcy in the regular world, yet made her an icon in the art world with enormous all-knowing eyes, a brooding mouth, naturally platinum hair, Jezebel-inspired eyeshadow, and boyish fashion. And you asked her if she felt there were obstacles for herself or other women in punk that men didn't have to deal with. And what was her response to that question?
Her response to that was that she felt like women who were in all female bands had to deal with that in a different way than like a woman who was fronting a band that had like all male players. She said, as being just a vocalist, I didn't play an instrument. No one was ever questioning my prowess as a vocalist or lyric writing. But I would say for women instrumentalists, there probably was a lot to overcome. Just, you know, people's attitudes that women can't play guitars or drums or bass. Well, sometimes bass, but not guitars or not drums. She said, I didn't experience that personally because I was singing. And she goes on to talk about how when she started playing guitar, she started to notice how men just like didn't take her as seriously. I liked how she acknowledged that she had a different experience, than women who were in all female bands or women who were playing instruments. Because there was sort of that precedent of like women being the vocalists of a band, that was
Right.
happening like before punk, but
Yeah.
like during punk was when women were like starting to experiment more with playing instruments in a way where they like had autonomy.
I'm curious if you notice any particular trend in the bands you spoke with in terms of where they came from. Like, did that make any difference? Were there things you picked up on that were consistent among the bands, say on the West Coast or the Midwest or the South?
I think New York is probably the best example of this because I think the way that people make art in New York, they really exist in scenes in a way that they don't necessarily in other cities. Like, I mean, different types of scenes is what I mean in New York. So like in New York, you had people who were playing kind of like art rock and you're doing punk stuff. And then you had like this no wave scene. You had people that were just like rebelling against that. And so like there were kind of like these different scenes, they were overlapping. And it was really interesting to kind of see like the way that they reacted to each other, like they were influencing each other and reacting to each other. And I think that in New York that was like really prevalent in a way that like it wasn't in like Chicago. Like in Chicago, a lot of these bands didn't even really know about each other. Like some of the women I talked to like didn't know about the other bands. Like they were like, "Oh, I
Really?
didn't even know they existed." And they all sound really different from one another.
And they didn't
So
cross paths in the same clubs or anything like that?
not as much. I mean, I think, like Kate Fagan knew Algebra Suicide, but like the members of Bitch didn't know the Dead Distics, so I don't know if it's the way that the city is set up. There's a lot of suburban clubs here and things like that. And it's just like, people are in different spaces, but like, yeah, so I did notice that. And I think that like the Midwest is really interesting that way. But like the bands in Chicago who didn't know each other, that was very different from like even bands like Cincinnati knew bands in Akron more than some of the Chicago bands knew each other. So I thought that was really interesting.
Well, let's talk about New York City. And you got somebody like Jane County, which I don't think anywhere else would have been given the opportunity to let it all out there and be herself. New York City, that's the place. And leads off the chapter on East Coast artists. You start with Jane County. She built her empire as a performer in the New York City punk scene in the 70s and was part of Andy Warhol's Factory, widely considered the first transgender woman to front a punk band, but rarely acknowledged as one of the first people to ever front a punk band. And she's been vocal about being overlooked and quoted from a 2003 interview, mentions David Bowie. That was interesting.
So yeah, I think Jane like moved to New York for that reason, like she was doing like drag stuff in her hometown, like around Atlanta, and was like, there were like places where she was doing drag, but it wasn't, as acceptable to do as it was in New York. And so when she moved to New York, it was like she just got to like find like all the weirdos and just talks about I read her book, Man Enough to Be a Woman. Which is where I got a lot of information about her. And, she just talks about how, like, when she moved to New York, she was just like, wow, there's weirdos everywhere. But yeah, in terms of the David Bowie thing, the quote that I have in the book is she says, "You ask David Bowie about me and he pretends like he doesn't even know me now. Bowie wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for me and Cherry Vanilla and them." And so, she's talked a lot about how David Bowie was kind of like visually like this straightish, guy until he started kind of hanging around. He met the cast of Pork, Andy Warhol's Pork. And then he just started kind of getting, more into like glam and like drag-ish stuff. I guess he wasn't really doing drag, but he was doing drag-ish, kind of like more queer stuff. She's also said that like David Bowie promised to record demos for her, and then that never happened. But like some of those ideas like popped up on some of his recordings.
So he knew her well then.
Yeah, they
Bowie knew.
they like decided to work together at one point.
Wow, okay. She had a right to get a little pissed off, overlooked. Why do you think did he ever mention her in interviews?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that according to her, he doesn't, and he hasn't said anything, but I haven't like done all the research to see whether or not he's ever acknowledged that influence. But according to her, he hasn't he never acknowledged it. So,
well, Wendy O. Williams from New York City legendary. And you do include the Plasmatics. They formed in 1978. The Plasmatics shows were, as you write, culture-shattering events. What were some of the things she did in concert, and what did she say about her love of smashing things?
Yeah, I mean, she's super aggressive, like on stage, she just like smash televisions, chainsaw guitars in half, she'd fire a shotgun. She's like partially nude all the time, super like sexually aggressive. And she loved it. Like she was calling out materialism. Here's a good quote. Ever since I was little, I've always liked to smash things. Basically, I hate conformity. I hate people telling me what to do. It makes me want to smash things. So-called normal behavior patterns make me so bored. I could throw up. The Plasmatics give me a chance to get this violence out of me and express it to other people. I don't like conformity. I don't like fashion. I don't like art. I do like smashing up expensive things.
Yeah, man, she was a legend, the late, great Wendy O. Williams. Well, Hit Girls, Women of Punk in the USA, 1975 to 1983. It's out now through Feral House, available wherever books are sold. So websites that you want to let people know about, or social media sites.
Yeah, I guess Bookshop helps the publisher a little bit more. It's maybe like the book will be about $2 more on Bookshop, but bookshop.org would be.
Okay. Bookshop.org.
And then my Instagram, which is pretty much the place where I've been like keeping everything lately, is at Conspiracy of Women, which is a Lydia Lunch reference.
Thank you so much for reaching out, sending me a copy of this book. It's amazing. And I have some more artists I need to listen to that I'm reading about in this book. I'm getting through a lot of them. And we were talking about some of them, they're hard to find, if at all. Some of them are not out there on streaming services, not on YouTube. And that's unfortunate. Yeah,
maybe some record labels that do like archival EPs and stuff will get their stuff out there.
Jen, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoy the book too. So thank you for having me.
That's it. It's in the books.